The following is going to be a reading of excerpts from the book The Kingdom of God is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. This was first published in the year 1894. I'm going to just read a little bit on the back cover here to put this in context for you if you're not familiar with who Leo Tolstoy was or what this book is about. So it says, quote, "The kingdom of God is within you" reveals Tolstoy's world outlook after his conversion to Christianity. And it also has on the back cover here a quote saying, "This is the keystone of Tolstoy's entire ethical structure." And another quote says that this is a highly significant book, end quote. And I would agree. I would agree that this is definitely a highly significant book. I don't actually like the title. I don't agree that the kingdom of God is simply within us. I think that's actually a mistranslation. I think the reign or activity of God can be found within us as the activity of the Holy Spirit, known as intuition, and externally via the guidance of the Father and the grace of the Son. So to say simply that it is only within you, I believe, is inaccurate and could possibly be misleading and even lead to illusions of grandeur where people think that they are actually equivalent to God. But nevertheless, the title aside, and his pacifism to the extreme, which I also don't agree with, as far as the idea of turning the other cheek, as I explained in other audios. That's yet again another mistranslation. Jesus actually said that if someone were to strike you on the cheek, to return to them one of the same kind, return to them likewise one of the same kind. So he was clarifying that not only eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but even if someone were to slap you, that you should not accept the abuse, that you should defend yourself without anger, and without any evil intent, but simply as an act of self-love, which corresponds to the greatest commandments, which he said was the most important moral law. And of course, the greatest commandments are to love God, love others, and love yourself. And if you let other people abuse you, that is definitely not an expression of self-love. All right, with that introductory statement, I will now proceed to read excerpts from this book. I'll start at the beginning and move to the end, reading portions that I've bracketed as being what I see are the most significant, the most important, worth hearing and contemplating and sharing with others. Tolstoy wrote, quote, "We come here upon what, in a large proportion of cases, forms the source of the grossest errors of mankind. Men on a lower level of understanding, when brought into contact with phenomena of a higher order, instead of making efforts to understand them, to raise themselves up to the point of view from which they must look at the subject, judge it from their lower standpoint, and the less they understand what they are talking about, the more confidently and unhesitatingly they pass judgment on it. The toiling masses, the immense majority of mankind who are suffering under the incessant, meaningless, and hopeless toil and privation in which their whole life is swallowed up, still find their keenest suffering in the glaring contrast between what is and what ought to be, according to all the beliefs held by themselves and those who have brought them to that condition and keep them in it. They know that they are in slavery and condemned to privation and darkness to minister to the lusts of the minority who keep them down. Every man of the present day, if we go down deep enough into the contradiction between his conscience and his life, is in a state of despair. The antagonism between life and the conscience may be removed in two ways: by a change of life or by a change of conscience. And there would seem there can be no doubt as to these alternatives. A man may cease to do what he regards as wrong, but he cannot cease to consider wrong what is wrong. Slavery was opposed to all the moral principles advocated by Plato and Aristotle, yet neither of them saw that, because to renounce slavery would have meant the breakup of the life they were living. We see the same thing in our modern world. The division of men into two castes, as well as the use of force in government and war, are opposed to every moral principle professed by our modern society. Yet the cultivated and advanced men of the day seem not to see it. The majority, if not all, of the cultivated men of our day try unconsciously to maintain the old social conception of life which justifies their position, and to hide from themselves and others its insufficiency, and above all the necessity of adopting the Christian conception of life, which will mean the break-up of the whole existing social order. They struggle to keep up the organization based on the social conception of life, but do not believe in it themselves, because it is extinct and it is impossible to believe in it. All modern literature, philosophical, political, and artistic, is striking in this respect. What wealth of idea, of form, of color, what erudition, what art, but what a lack of serious matter, what dread of any exactitude of thought or expression. Subtleties, allegories, humorous fancies, the widest generalizations, but nothing simple and clear, nothing going straight to the point, that is, to the problem of life. Governments are living principally on the drunkenness of the people, and pretend to encourage education when their whole strength is based on ignorance, and to support constitutional freedom when their strength rests on the absence of freedom, and to be anxious for the improvement of the condition of the working classes when their very existence depends on their oppression, and to support Christianity when Christianity destroys all government. To be able to do this, they have long ago elaborated methods encouraging temperance, which cannot suppress drunkenness, methods of supporting education, which not only fail to prevent ignorance, but even increase it, methods of aiming at freedom and constitutionalism, which are no hindrance to despotism, methods of protecting the working classes, which will not free them from slavery. And a Christianity, too, they have elaborated, which does not destroy, but supports governments. It is generally supposed that governments strengthen their forces only to defend the state from other states, in oblivion of the fact that armies are necessary before all things for the defense of governments from their own oppressed and enslaved subjects. If the laborer has no land, if he cannot use the natural right of every man to derive subsistence himself and his family out of the land, that is not because the people wish it to be so, but because a certain set of men, the landowners, have appropriated the right of giving or refusing admittance to the land to the laborers. And this abnormal order of things is maintained by the army. Armies, then, are needed by governments and by the ruling classes above all to support the present order, which, far from being the result of the people's needs, is often in direct antagonism to them, and is only beneficial to the government and ruling classes. To keep their subjects in oppression and to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, the government must have armed forces. The despotism of a government always increases with the strength of the army and its external successes, and the aggressiveness of a government increases with its internal despotism. In our day, governments not only fail to encourage, but directly hinder every movement by which people try to work out new forms of life for themselves. Every attempt at the solution of the problems of labor, land, politics, and religion meets with direct opposition on the part of government. There is no one today who does not see the uselessness and injustice of collecting taxes from the toiling masses to enrich idle officials, or the senselessness of inflicting punishments on weak or depraved persons in the shape of transportation from one place to another, or of imprisonment in a fortress where, living in security and indolence, they only become weaker and more depraved, or the worse than uselessness and injustice, the positive insanity and barbarity of preparations for war and of wars, causing devastation and ruin, and having no kind of justification. Yet these forms of violence continue and are supported by the very people who see their uselessness, injustice, and cruelty, and suffer from them. Governments and the ruling classes no longer take their stand on right or even on the semblance of justice, but on a skillful organization carried to such a point of perfection by the aid of science that everyone is caught in the circle of violence and has no chance of escaping it. This circle is made up now of 4 methods of working upon men, joined together like the links of a chain ring. The first and oldest method is intimidation. The second method is corruption. The third method is what I can only describe as hypnotizing the people. This consists in checking the moral development of men, and by various suggestions, keeping them back in the ideal of life outgrown by mankind at large, on which the power of government rests. This hypnotizing process is organized at the present in the most complex manner, and starting from their earliest childhood, continues to act on men till the day of their death. It begins in their earliest years in the compulsory schools, created for this purpose, in which the children have instilled into them the ideas of life of their ancestors, which are in direct antagonism with the conscience of the modern world. In countries where there is a state religion, they teach the children the senseless blasphemies of the church catechisms, together with the duty of obedience to their superiors. In republican states, they teach them the savage superstition of patriotism and the same pretended obedience to the governing authorities. The process is kept up during later years by the encouragement of religious and patriotic superstitions. The religious superstition is encouraged by establishing, with money taken from the people, temples, processions, memorials, and festivals, which, aided by painting, architecture, music, and incense, intoxicate the people, and above all by the support of the clergy, whose duty consists in brutalizing the people and keeping them in a permanent state of stupefaction by their teaching, the solemnity of their services, their sermons, and their interference in private life, at births, deaths, and marriages. The patriotic superstition is encouraged by the creation, with money taken from the people, to dispose men to attach importance to their own nation and to the aggrandizement of the state and its rulers, and to feel antagonism and even hatred for other nations. With these objects under despotic governments, there is direct prohibition against printing and disseminating books to enlighten the people, and everyone who might rouse the people from their lethargy is exiled or imprisoned. Moreover, under every government, without exception, everything is kept back that might emancipate, and everything encouraged that tends to corrupt the people, such as literary works tending to keep them in the barbarism of religious and patriotic superstition, all kinds of sensual amusements, spectacles, circuses, theaters, and even the physical means of inducing stupefaction, as tobacco and alcohol, which form the principal source of revenue of states. Even prostitution is encouraged, and not only recognized, but even organized by the government in the majority of states. The fourth method consists in selecting from all the men who have been stupefied and enslaved by the three former methods a certain number, exposing them to special and intensified means of stupefaction and brutalization, and so making them into a passive instrument for carrying out all the cruelties and brutalities needed by the government. This result is attained by taking them at the youthful age when men have not had time to form clear and definite principles of morals, and removing them from all natural and human conditions of life, home, family, and kindred, and useful labor. They are shut up together in barracks, dressed in special clothes, and worked upon by cries, drums, music, and shining objects, to go through certain daily actions invented for this purpose, and by this means are brought into a hypnotic condition in which they cease to be men and become mere senseless machines, submissive to their hypnotizer. These physically vigorous young men, in these days of universal conscription, all young men, hypnotized, armed with murderous weapons, always obedient to the governing authorities, and ready for any act of violence at their command, constitute the fourth and principal method of enslaving men. By this method the circle of violence is completed. Intimidation, corruption, and hypnotizing bring people into a condition in which they are willing to be soldiers. The soldiers give the power of punishing and plundering them, and purchasing officials with the spoils, and hypnotizing them and converting them in time into these same soldiers again. The circle is complete, and there is no chance of breaking through it by force. They deceive themselves and others, and their efforts do not better the position of the oppressed, but only make it worse. Their conduct only tends to increase the despotism of government. Their efforts only afford a plausible pretext for government to strengthen their power. All the evil seems to exist through some cause independent of the conscience of men. Strange and contradictory as it seems, all men of the present day hate the very social order they are themselves supporting. But, however much they try to deceive themselves and others, they all know that what they are doing is opposed to all the beliefs which they profess, and in the depths of their souls, when they are left alone with their conscience, they are ashamed and miserable at the recollection of it, especially if the baseness of their action has been pointed out to them. A man of the present day, whether he believes in the divinity of Christ or not, cannot fail to see that to assist in the capacity of Tsar, minister, governor, or commissioner, in taking from a poor family its last cow for taxes to be spent on cannons, or on the pay and pensions of idle officials who live in luxury and are worse than useless, or in putting into prison some man we have ourselves corrupted and throwing his family on the streets, or in plundering and butchering in war, or inculcating savage and idolatrous superstitions in the place of the law of Christ, or in impounding the cow found on one's land, though it belongs to a man who has no land, or to cheat the workman in a factory by imposing fines for accidentally spoiled articles, or making a poor man pay double the value for anything, simply because he is in the direst poverty. Not a man of the present day can fail to know that all these actions are base and disgraceful, and that they need not do them. They all know it. They know that what they are doing is wrong, and would not do it if for anything in the world, if they had the power of resisting the forces which shut their eyes to the criminality of their actions and impel them to commit them. The Christian not only cannot promise to obey the will of any other man, without knowing what will be required by that will, He not only cannot obey the changing laws of man, but he cannot even promise to do anything definite at a certain time, or to abstain from doing anything for a certain time. For he cannot know what at any time will be required of him by that Christian law of love, obedience to which constitutes the meaning of life for him. In fact, take any man of the present time whatever. I don't mean a true Christian, but an average man of the present day, educated or uneducated, believing or unbelieving, rich or poor, married or unmarried. Such a man lives working at his work, or enjoying his amusements, spending the fruits of his labors on himself or on those near to him, and like everyone, hating every kind of restriction and deprivation, dissension and suffering. Such a man is going his way peaceably, when suddenly people come and say to him, "First, promise and swear to us that you will slavishly obey us in everything we dictate to you, and will consider absolutely good and authoritative everything we plan, decide, and call law. Secondly, hand over a part of the fruits of your labor for us to dispose of. We will use the money to keep you in slavery, and to hinder you from forcibly opposing our orders. Thirdly, elect others, or be yourself elected, to take a pretended share in the government, knowing all the while that the government will proceed quite without regard to the foolish speeches you, and those like you, may utter, and knowing that its proceedings will be, according to our will, the will of those who have the army in their hands. Fourthly, come at a certain time to the law courts and take your share in those senseless cruelties which we perpetrate on sinners and those whom we have corrupted, in the shape of penal servitude, exile, solitary confinement, and death. And fifthly and lastly, more than all this, in spite of the fact that you may be on the friendliest terms with people of other nations, be ready, directly we order you to do so, to regard those whom we indicate to you as your enemies, and be ready to assist, either in person or by proxy, in devastation, plunder, and murder of their men, women, children, and aged alike, possibly your own kinsmen or relations, if that is necessary to us. One would expect that every man of the present day who has a grain of sense left might reply to such requirements. But why should I do all this? Why am I to hand over the fruits of my labors to them in the shape of taxes, knowing that the money will be spent on the support of officials, prisons, churches, armies, on things that are harmful, and on my own enslavement? Why should I punish myself? The fact that freedom of all men will be brought about only through the freedom of individual persons becomes more and more clear as time goes on. All state obligations are against the conscience of a Christian. The oath of allegiance, taxes, law proceedings, and military service, and the whole power of the government rests on these very obligations. Thus, they refuse the voluntary payment of taxes, because taxes are spent on deeds of violence, on the pay of men of violence, soldiers on the construction of prisons, fortresses, and cannons. They, as Christians, regard it as sinful and immoral to have any hand in such deeds. To punish men for refusing to act against their conscience, the government must renounce all claim to good sense and benevolence. Christianity, in its true sense, puts an end to government. The profession of true Christianity not only excludes the possibility of recognizing government, but even destroys its very foundations. If a man, through the growth of a higher conscience, can no longer comply with the demands of government, he finds himself cramped by it, and at the same time no longer needs its protection. When this comes to pass, the question whether men are ready to discard the governmental type is solved, and the conclusion will be as final for them as for the young birds hatched out of the eggs. Just as no power in the world can put them back into the shells, so can no power in the world bring men again under the governmental type of society when once they have outgrown it. All men who happen to be in authority assert that their authority is necessary to keep the bad from oppressing the good, assuming that they themselves are the good, par excellence, who protect other good people from the bad. But ruling means using force, and using force means doing to him to whom force is used what he does not like, and what he who uses the force would certainly not like done to himself. Consequently, ruling means doing to others what we would not they should do unto us, that is, doing wrong. To submit means to prefer suffering to using force, and to prefer suffering to using force means to be good, or at least less wicked than those who do unto others what they would not like themselves. And therefore, in all probability, not the better but the worse have always ruled and are ruling now. There may be bad men among those who are ruled, but it cannot be that those who are better have generally ruled those who are worse. Therefore, by Christ's teaching, there can be no doubt whether the good are to be found among rulers or ruled, and whether the wicked are among the ruled or the rulers. Indeed, it is absurd even to speak of Christians ruling. The whole history of pagan times is nothing but a recital of the incidents and means by which the more wicked gained possession of power over the less wicked, and retained it by cruelties and deceptions, ruling over the good under the pretense of guarding the right and protecting the good from the wicked. All the revolutions in history are only examples of the more wicked seizing power and oppressing the good, in declaring that if their authority did not exist, the more wicked would oppress the good, and the ruling authorities only show their disinclination to let others oppressors come to power who would like to snatch it from them. But in asserting this, they only accuse themselves. They say that their power, i.e., violence, is needed to defend men from other possible oppressors in the present or the future. The weakness of the use of violence lies in the fact that all the arguments brought forward by oppressors in their own defense can with even better reason be advanced against them. They plead the danger of violence, most often imagined in the future, but they are all the while continuing to practice actual violence themselves. You say that men used to pillage and murder in the past, and that you are afraid that they will pillage and murder one another if your power were no more. That may happen, or it may not happen, but the fact that you ruin thousands of men in prisons, fortresses, galleys, and exile, break up millions of families, and ruin millions of men, physically as well as morally, in the army, that fact is not an imaginary but a real act of violence, which according to your own argument one ought to oppose by violence. And so you are yourselves these wicked men, against whom, according to your own argument, it is absolutely necessary to use violence. The oppressed are sure to say to their oppressors, so that the very violence which the champions of government hold up as a terror, pretending that except for its oppressive power, the wicked would oppress the good, has really always existed and will exist in human society. And therefore the suppression of state violence cannot in any case be the cause of increased oppression of the good by the wicked. If state violence ceased, there would be acts of violence perhaps on the part of different people, of those who had done deeds of violence before. But the total amount of violence could not in any case be increased by the mere fact of power passing from one set of men to another. And therefore, the assertion of the champions of the state that if the power of government were suppressed, the wicked would oppress the good, not only fails to show that it is to be dreaded, since it is just what happens now, but proves, on the contrary, that it is governmental power which enables the wicked to oppress the good, and it is the evil most desirable to suppress, and that it is being gradually suppressed in the natural course of things. But if it be true that governmental power will disappear when those in power become so Christian that they renounce power of their own accord, and there are no men found willing to take their place, and even if this process is already going on, say the champions of the existing order, when will that come to pass, if after 1800 years there are still so many eager for power and so few anxious to obey, there seems no likelihood of it happening very soon, or indeed of it ever happening at all. The single process of all men, separately and successively, realizing each for himself the emptiness of power, and reaching Christian truth by the inner spiritual path. Let the murderers, say the champions of state violence, set us the example by giving up murder, and then we will give it up. But the murderers say just the same, only with more right. They say, let those who have undertaken to teach us and guide us set us the example of giving up legal murder, and then we will imitate them. And they say this not as a jest, but seriously, because it is the actual state of the case. We cannot give up the use of violence, because we are surrounded by violent ruffians. Nothing in our days hinders the progress of humanity and the establishment of the organization corresponding to its present development more than this false reasoning. Those in authority are convinced that men are only guided and only progress through the use of force, and therefore they confidently make use of it to support the existing organization. The existing order is maintained, not by force, but by public opinion, the action of which is disturbed by the use of force, so that the effect of using force is to disturb and to weaken the very thing it tries to maintain. They are mistaken, because force does not protect humanity, but on the contrary deprives it of the only possible means of really protecting itself, that is, the establishment and diffusion of a Christian public opinion. Only by the suppression of violence will a Christian public opinion cease to be corrupted, and be enabled to be diffused without hindrance, and men will then turn their efforts in the spiritual direction by which alone they can advance. So that the prophecy that the time will come when men will be taught of God, will learn war no more, will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into reaping hooks, which means, translating it into our language, the fortresses, prisons, barracks, palaces, and churches will remain empty, and all the gibbets and guns and cannons will be left unused, is no longer a dream, but the definite new form of life to which mankind is approaching with ever-increasing rapidity. And we need only each begin to do what we ought to do, and we need only each live with all the light that is in us, to bring about at once the promised kingdom of God to which every man's heart is yearning. The authorities, those who have started, devised, and decreed the matter, will say that such acts are necessary for the maintenance of the existing order. The maintenance of the existing order is necessary for the welfare of the country and of humanity, for the possibility of social existence and human progress. Men of the poorer class, peasants and soldiers, who will have to execute the deed of violence with their own hands, say that they do so because it is the command of their superior authority, and the superior authority knows what he is about. That those are in authority who ought to be in authority, and that they know what they are doing appears to them a truth of which there can be no doubt. If they could admit the possibility of mistake or error, it would only be in functionaries of a lower grade. The highest authority on which all the rest depends seems to them immaculate beyond suspicion. Though expressing the motives of their conduct differently, both those in command and their subordinates are agreed in saying that they act thus because the existing order is the order which must and ought to exist at the present time, and that therefore to support it is the sacred duty of every man. On this acceptance of the necessity and therefore immutability of the existing order, all who take part in acts of violence on the part of government base the argument always advanced in their justification. Since the existing order is immutable, they say, the refusal of a single individual to perform the duties laid upon him will effect no change in things, and will only mean that some other man will be put in his place who may do the work worse, that is to say, more cruelly, to the still greater injury of the victims of the act of violence. This conviction that the existing order is the necessary and therefore immutable order which it is a sacred duty for every man to support, enables good men, of high principles in private life, to take part with conscience more or less untroubled in crimes such as that perpetrated in Oral and that which the men in the Tula train were going to perpetrate. But what is this conviction based on? It is easy to understand that the landowner prefers to believe that the existing order is inevitable and immutable, because this existing order secures him an income from his hundreds and thousands of acres, by means of which he can lead his habitual, indolent, and luxurious life. A simple, uncorrupted youth cannot imagine that those who stand so high in his opinion, whom he regards as holy, or learned men, could for any object whatever mislead him so shamefully. But this is just what has always been and always is done to him. It is done, number one, by instilling, by example and direct instruction, from childhood up, into the working people, who have not time to study moral and religious questions for themselves, the idea that torture and murder are compatible with Christianity, and that for certain objects of state, torture and murder are not only admissible, but ought to be employed. And number two, by instilling into certain of the people who have either voluntarily enlisted or been taken by compulsion into the army, the idea that the perpetration of murder and torture with their own hands is a sacred duty and even a glorious exploit, worthy of praise and reward. The whole power of the army and the state is based, in reality, on this delusive emancipation of men from their duty to God and their conscience, and the substitution of duty to their superior officer for all other duties. Putting aside the sin of deluding men into regarding the most awful crime as a duty, putting aside the revolting sin of using the name and authority of Christ to sanction what he most condemned. Why is it that not only governments but private persons of the higher classes try so jealously to maintain the ignorance of the people? Why do they fall with such fury on any effort at breaking down religious superstitions or really enlightening the people? Why do historians, novelists, and poets, who have no hope of gaining anything by their flatteries, make heroes of kings, emperors, and conquerors of past time? Why do men who call themselves learned dedicate whole lifetimes to making theories to prove that violence employed by authority against the people is not violence at all, but a special right? The conscience is there, but it has been put to sleep. In those in command by what the psychologists call autosuggestion, in the soldiers by the direct conscious hypnotizing exerted by the higher classes. Though asleep, the conscience is there, and in spite of the hypnotism, it is already speaking in them, and it may awake. The truth, which is one, but falsehoods, which are many. The sole means of uniting men is their union in the truth. And therefore, the more sincerely men strive toward the truth, the nearer they get to unity. But how can men be united in the truth, or even approximate to it, if they do not even express the truth they know, but hold that there is no need to do so, and pretend to regard as truth what they believe to be false? And therefore no improvement is possible so long as men are hypocritical and hide the truth from themselves, so long as they do not recognize that their union and therefore their welfare is only possible in the truth, and do not put the recognition and profession of the truth revealed to them higher than everything else. It is not theft, nor robbery, nor murder, nor fornication, but falsehood, the special falsehood of hypocrisy, which corrupts men, brutalizes them, and makes them vindictive, destroys all distinction between right and wrong in their conscience, deprives them of what is the true meaning of all real human life, and debars them from all progress toward perfection. thieves, robbers, murderers, and cheats, who commit crimes recognized by themselves and everyone else as evil, serve as an example of what ought not to be done, and deter others from similar crimes. But those who commit the same thefts, robberies, murders, and other crimes, disguising them under all kinds of religious or scientific or humanitarian justifications, as all landowners, merchants, manufacturers, and government officials do, provoke others to imitation, and so do harm not only to those who are directly the victims of their crimes, but to thousands and millions of men whom they corrupt by obliterating their sense of the distinction between right and wrong. We cannot persuade ourselves and others that we do not know that men do not like dying of hunger, bereft of the right to gain their subsistence from the earth on which they live, that they do not like working underground, in the water, or in the stifling heat, for 10 to 14 hours a day, at night in factories, to manufacture objects for our pleasure. One would imagine it impossible to deny what is so obvious, yet it is denied. Hypocrisy in our day is supported on two sides, by false religion and by false science, and it has reached such proportions that if we were not living in its midst, we could not believe that men could attain such a pitch of self-deception. Men of the present day have come into such an extraordinary condition, their hearts are so hardened, that seeing they see not, hearing they do not hear, and understand not. Men have long been living in antagonism to their conscience. If it were not for the hypocrisy, they could not go on living such a life. This social organization, in opposition to their conscience, only continues to exist because it is disguised by hypocrisy. And the greater the divergence between actual life and men's conscience, the greater the extension of hypocrisy. But even hypocrisy has its limits, and it seems to me that we have reached those limits in the present day. But man is not stationary in regard to truth, but every individual man, as he passes through life, and humanity as a whole in the same way, is continually learning to know a greater and greater degree of truth, and growing more and more free from error. Even the most unreflecting man sees today the impossibility, that is, of life continuing on its old basis, and the necessity of establishing new forms of life. It is clear now, from the very simplest, most commonplace point of view, that it is madness to remain under the roof of a building which cannot support its weight, and that we must leave it.